The shortest flight imaginable, less than 20 minutes across the Gulf. The plane was sound, the crew experienced, the route flown hundreds of times, and 25 people dead. The worst air disaster in Finland's history, a record that still stands today. On the 3rd of January, 1961, a Douglas DC-3 operating Aeroflot 311 stalled into a spin right by the runway and crashed into the winter forest near Kvevlax. A healthy aircraft doesn't just fall out of the sky on its own. So what knocked out both pilots at once? The answer wasn't found in the wreckage, and it wasn't in the weather. It was in a blood test. And it's still hard to believe, because everything had been decided before the plane ever left the ground. A dark winter morning hangs over the western coast of Finland. The sun isn't up yet. Below the wing there's snow, frost, the scattered lights of coastal villages. Aeroflot 311 climbs into the sky, a short domestic hop, the kind the country runs by the dozen every single day. The aircraft is a Douglas DC-3, the workhorse of post-war aviation. Registration, Oscar Hotel Lima, Charlie Charlie. It belongs to Aero, the very company that would later become known the world over as Finnair. The route is simple, from Kronoby Airport to Vasa, two coastal towns just a few dozen kilometers apart. On the schedule, the whole flight takes less than 20 minutes. It isn't really a journey at all, more like a short leap across the Gulf. There are 25 people on board. 22 passengers and 3 crew, people heading off about their business on a winter morning. None of them know this flight will never reach the runway. A few minutes after takeoff, the plane will fall into an uncontrolled descent and slam into the forest near the village of Kvevlax. No one will survive. A brief domestic hop will turn into the most terrible disaster Finnish aviation had ever seen up to that point. And what's unsettling here isn't the crash itself. It's that at first glance, there's nothing to explain it. The aircraft was completely sound. The crew was experienced, the route familiar, the weather not stormy. All the usual culprits, machinery, ice, storms, fall away one by one. Something took out both pilots at once, and it did it while they were still on the ground. To understand what happened that morning, we have to rewind a few hours, to a night the crew spent in a way no one should before an early departure. The investigation would later reconstruct it almost minute by minute. Captain Lars Hattinen and First Officer Veikko Halma weren't sleeping, they were drinking. And not a couple of glasses with dinner, but hard and long. According to the investigators, there was a third man with them, possibly the very person later suspected of visiting the cockpit while the plane was already in the air. The numbers that would later go into the report sound insane for men about to take the controls of a passenger plane. Between 10 to 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning, the table held 16 bottles of beer, 7 gin grogs, and 900 grams of cognac. The party broke up deep in the night, and the flight was set for early morning. Between the last drink and takeoff, there were only a few hours. Hours that should have been spent sleeping, not sobering up. In the morning, both showed up for the flight. On the surface, a crew like any other. Uniforms, paperwork, the familiar routine. In reality, 2 sleep-deprived, still drunk men whose bodies hadn't had time to process what they'd drunk. Neither the controllers in Kronoby nor the 22 passengers in the cabin knew, or could have known, the state of the men who were about to fly the plane. In that era, keeping a crew sober rested almost entirely on their word. The disaster was set in motion before anyone fastened a seatbelt. Everything that would doom this flight had been decided at the table, over the clink of glasses, long before dawn. Let's set that morning aside for a moment and talk about why alcohol and an aircraft cockpit are fundamentally incompatible. This will matter for the whole series. We'll be talking more than once about the numbers in pilots' blood. The level of intoxication is measured by the amount of alcohol in the blood. In English, that's BAC, blood alcohol content, often given in per mille, parts per thousand. At autopsy, it's determined from samples of blood and tissue, and those numbers don't lie. They show exactly how much alcohol a person was carrying at the moment of death. The trouble is that alcohol hits precisely the abilities that matter most in flight. Reaction time slows, and on final approach, fractions of a second count. Coordination falls apart, movements turn clumsy and late. Judgment of the situation weakens. A drunk person overrates himself and underrates the danger. The field of attention narrows, tunnel vision sets in, when a pilot fixates on one instrument and loses the whole picture. The most insidious of all is spatial disorientation. In the dark, with no visible horizon, the brain relies only on the instruments and an inner sense of balance. Alcohol breaks that very sense. A drunk pilot may genuinely not know which way is up and which is down, and fly the machine straight into the ground while certain he's flying level. That's why modern rules are strict. The principle is called bottle to throttle. The standard requires at least 8 hours between the last drink and taking the controls. And if the alcohol in your blood is over the limit, you can't sit in that seat at all. And it isn't only obvious drunkenness that's dangerous. Lingering intoxication and a hangover keep eating away at reaction and attention for hours after a person already feels sober. In the 60s, alcohol was found in the blood of a third of the small aviation pilots who died in crashes. When the rules were tightened and testing was brought in, that share dropped several-fold. Flight 311 is exactly one of those cases that made the world take this seriously. Let's return to Kronaby, that early morning of the 3rd of January. Outside, it's deep Finnish winter, dark, freezing, almost no light. At these latitudes in January, dawn comes late and grudgingly, so the takeoff happens essentially at night, under the apron lights. On paper, it's all boring routine. The aircraft is sound. The investigation would later confirm it, finding not a single technical failure. The engines are running, the plane is fueled, the passengers are in their seats. DC-3s of this type flew by the thousands all over the world and were considered some of the most reliable machines of their time. Departure is slightly delayed. By the schedule, the flight should have left at exactly 7, but in fact, the plane lifts off around 7:16. The small delay alarms no one, perfectly ordinary. Vasa is no distance at all, and the crew had flown this route many times before. The way is familiar down to the last detail: heading, altitude, turning points, the approach to the runway. From the outside, it's the most ordinary short flight there is. On takeoff, nothing hints at trouble. The plane climbs, settles onto its heading, and disappears into the dark sky toward Vasa. In the cockpit are 2 men who, outwardly, are doing everything right. And from the outside, there's simply no way to tell their reactions are slowed and their perception blurred by a night of drinking. The worst of it hides in exactly this ordinariness. The disaster gives off no warning, no smoke, no alarm on the radio, no failed engine, no storm front ahead. Just a short, familiar flight that begins entirely to plan. 25 people are flying over the snow-covered coast, certain they'll be on the ground in a few minutes, and the clock is already running down to the end. The plane nears Vasa, and the crew begins preparing for the approach, the most demanding part of any flight. Here, you have to descend along a precise path, bleed off exactly the right amount of speed, and hold the machine within tight limits of bank and heading. It was also then that the last radio exchange with the controllers took place. By the recordings, it's entirely routine. No sign of alarm, no hint of an abnormal situation. The voices on the air sound normal, the crew reporting as if nothing were wrong. To the controllers, Flight 311 is calmly coming into land, like hundreds of flights before it. The plane descends below 50 meters above the ground. In itself, that's normal. On the final stage of the approach, the machine should be low, lining itself up with the runway. The altitude drops smoothly, the engines run steadily. The ground is within reach, the landing only seconds away. On the ground at Kvevlax, there are witnesses. In the pre-dawn dark, they notice the lights of the approaching plane. Points in a black sky, easy to recognize as a machine coming in. These people will be the last to see Flight 311 in the air, and their accounts will later form the basis of the reconstruction. So far, everything is within limits. The plane is whole, the engines fine, the radio calm, the altitude correct. But now, in the lowest and most demanding phase of the flight, the crew's slowed reactions and clouded perception count for the most. In a few seconds, the routine descent will break off, and the calm lights in the sky will, before the witness's eyes, begin to fall. And then, everything collapses in seconds. For no visible reason, the plane banks sharply to the left. Not a smooth turn, but a rough jerk that has no place on final approach. The machine loses speed. When a plane moves too slowly and at the wrong angle, the air stops flowing over the wing the way it should, and the wing stops holding. Lift vanishes. The heavy DC-3 drops and no longer responds. This is a stall, something a pilot must never allow at all, least of all near the ground, where there's no height left to recover. The pilots push the engines to full throttle, a reflex, an attempt to add power, gain speed, keep the machine in the air. But the throttle can't save it now. The plane stalled too sharply and too low. The engines roar at maximum, and the wings still won't hold. The machine enters a spin, a rotation with loss of altitude, the kind you simply cannot recover from at that height. From the ground, the witnesses notice an important detail. In the final moments, the crew switches on the landing lights, two bright beams flaring in the dark. Perhaps it was a desperate attempt to make out the ground, to figure out where down was, to catch the slipping horizon. The beams pick trees out of the gloom. The plane tips over at an angle of about 70 degrees, almost on its side, nose down. This is no longer flight, but a fall in a spiral. From the first bank to this moment, literally seconds. The 25 people aboard can do nothing. It's all being settled in the cockpit, where the two at the controls are physically incapable of bringing the machine back under control. The lights that a moment ago were drifting toward the runway plunge into the black forest. 7:40 and 30 seconds in the morning. The plane slams into the forest near Kvevlax. The impact ends Flight 311 for good. From takeoff at Kronaby to this second, about 24 minutes had passed, less than the commute to work in a big city. A flight that should have ended taxiing to the Vasa terminal ended instead among the snow-covered trees. 25 people aboard, no survivors. Among the winter forest lay the wreckage of the DC-3. Silence, frost, early darkness, and pieces of a plane scattered between the trunks. A plane that just minutes earlier had been a sound machine on final approach. For a small country, this was unheard of. Nothing more terrible had ever happened in Finnish aviation until then. The authorities reacted fast. That same day, the 3rd of January, the Ministry of Transport appointed a commission of inquiry. They didn't drag it out for weeks. The investigation was launched on the spot. By 12:30, the investigators were already working at the wreckage, beginning the painstaking reconstruction. They faced a riddle. The type was proven and reliable, the crew experienced, the route short and familiar, the weather calm. Not one of the usual leads explained why the plane had suddenly fallen on approach, so the cause had to be sought where it wasn't immediately visible. The commission's first question was simple: what failed? The machine, the weather, or the people? They started with the simplest and most likely answer. In the aviation of the 60s, when a plane went down on approach in the dark, 3 usual causes came to mind: a technical failure, icing, and a weather trap. So they worked through them one by one. The technical failure theory seemed logical. The DC-3 is a reliable machine, but not immortal. An engine could quit, a control could jam, the wiring could let it down. The investigators take apart the wreckage, examine the components, look for signs of the breakdown that would explain the sudden bank and stall. And they find none. There were no serious failures. The plane was sound at the moment of the approach. The second thought was icing. A winter morning, frost, damp air over the Gulf. Ice on the wing changes its shape, weighs the machine down and ruins its airflow, and that can well lead to a stall. But the investigation deems this theory unlikely too. The conditions that night didn't point to heavy ice, and the pattern of destruction didn't match it either. The weather as a whole doesn't hold up as a cause either. Yes, it was dark and wintry, but not stormy. Not the kind of case where a plane is broken by a front or wind shear. Thousands of flights were made in far harsher conditions and landed safely. And here the picture stops adding up. The plane is sound, the weather bearable, no failures. And yet, the machine still fell into a spin right by the ground. Once the machinery and the weather are crossed off, one last link remains, the one you don't want to look at first, the people at the controls themselves. And here comes into play what, in any air crash investigation, is done with the bodies of dead pilots: a medical examination. An autopsy of the crew is a standard procedure in any air disaster. The pathologist looks for whether the pilot had a sudden seizure, a heart attack, carbon monoxide poisoning, any hidden cause that would explain the loss of control. On the bodies of Hattinen and Halma, a blood test is also done. The result turns out to be grim and unexpected. Captain Lars Hattinen's blood alcohol is around 2 per mil. This isn't had a drink yesterday and didn't sleep well. This is a level of intoxication at which a person struggles to walk a straight line, let alone fly a plane. That's flatly out of the question. First Officer Veikko Halma's is about 1.56 per mil, also far beyond any permissible limit. These numbers change everything. Until now, the picture hadn't added up precisely because the investigation had been searching for a fault in the machine. Now it's clear. It was the people who were broken. Both pilots. Both, not one. Which means the crew had no last line of defense left. Both were drunk to a degree that gave them no right whatsoever to take the controls of a passenger flight. And it's these results that make it possible to reconstruct the whole night before the flight. That very party until 2 in the morning. The lack of sleep. Showing up for duty in a state the body hadn't had time to process. The scattered fragments line up into one straight path, from the table to the impact in the forest. With the answer comes a cold understanding. This was not a riddle of machinery, but a riddle of human decision. One question does remain, though, a purely engineering one. How exactly did the drinking turn the approach to a familiar runway into a fatal spin? Why did the drunk crew destroy the machine this way, and not another? To connect the per mille with that 70-degree bank, we have to recall which phase of the flight ended it. An approach to land in the dark is the most demanding regime of all. Holding low speed right at the edge of a stall, precisely maintaining the bank without losing heading or altitude, and all of it without a visible horizon, by instruments and by feel. For a sober, rested pilot, this is hard but routine work. For 2 drunk and sleep-deprived men, it's almost impossible. All those failings discussed earlier converge at once, in the dark, near the ground. And it's enough to hold the bank a touch too long or shed a little too much speed for the machine to stall. And that's exactly what happened. A sharp left bank and loss of speed, the classic picture of loss of control on approach. The pilot works the controls imprecisely, the machine slips past the safe regime, the wing stops holding. The full throttle the crew gave was already too late. At that height and that angle, the engines can't save it. The official probable cause the investigation reached is stated with restraint, a piloting error during the execution of a left turn. But behind those dry words lies no chance slip by a tired professional. Behind them is a condition in which the crew was physically unable to fly the plane accurately. Error here isn't a glitch amid correct actions, but the direct consequence of the fact that the controls were held by men who had no business being there. And since the cause is that clear, the next question arises. Could it have been prevented? And what was done to keep it from happening again? The bitter paradox is that a ban on flying while intoxicated already existed in 1961. It was written into the international standards of civil aviation and into the pilot's own contracts. Formally, Hattinen and Halma broke a rule they knew by heart. Sitting drunk at the controls was forbidden, and that was no secret to anyone. It took the disaster to show that a ban on paper isn't enough. The rule existed, but almost no one undertook to check that it was followed. Everything rested on the crew's own discipline, on the word of men who, that night, did not keep it. No pre-flight checks, no monitoring of the pilot's condition, no mechanism capable of turning a drunk crew away at the boarding stairs. After Kevlax, Finland tightened the rules on alcohol and on clearing crews for flight. The country's worst air disaster became a lesson hard to forget, a lesson about the human factor in the most literal sense. 25 dead turned out to be the price of a decision made long before dawn, at a table with a bottle. And that's what's distinctive about Flight 311. In major commercial aviation, alcohol becomes the cause of a disaster extremely rarely, and that's why such cases hit so hard and are remembered so long. Here, not a single rivet let go, not a single instrument failed, no storm struck. The plane was sound right up to the last second. It was destroyed not by the machine and not by the weather, but by two men who came to work drunk. Kvevlax opens our tally. Alcohol at the controls killed before it and after it, in other countries, on other types, under other circumstances. But every time, at the root lay the same simple and unforgivable decision the crew made while still on the ground. A perfectly good airplane, a certified crew, a routine nighttime approach to landing, and a minute and a half later, a roll over the wing and a crash into the ground that killed all 88 people on board. What killed Aeroflot Flight 821, Moscow to Perm, in September of 2008? Not a storm, not a terrorist attack, not an engine failure. It all came down to an instrument the size of your palm, an attitude indicator that the captain read exactly backwards. The Soviet and the Western schools of engineering draw it as mirror images of each other. And in thick clouds with no visible horizon, the habit of the eye turned out to be fatal. This is the story of a man who stopped understanding where the sky was and where the ground was. September 14th, 2008, around 10 minutes past 5 in the morning local time. Over Perm, it's still deep night. The sky is choked with low cloud. The city beneath the wing is almost invisible, just a few scattered lights breaking through the clouds. Aeroflot Flight 821 from Moscow is on approach to Bolshoi Savino Airport. An ordinary night flight, the kind there are hundreds of across the country every night. There are 88 people on board, 82 passengers and 6 crew members. Most of them are asleep or dozing, belted in for landing. The aircraft is a Boeing 737-500, a mid-class machine, reliable and well understood. The hardware is sound, the weather is workable, the approach is running by the standard procedure. Nobody expects trouble, not the people in the cabin, not the controller on the ground guiding the flight toward the runway. And yet, within a few minutes, the airplane will slip out of control. No explosion, no fire, no engine failure. In a minute and a half, a perfectly sound machine will roll over its wing and slam into the ground beside a railway line. No one on board will survive. How did a calm nighttime approach turn into a disaster? The culprit will turn out to be a dial on the instrument panel that deceived the man at the controls that night. Or rather, it wasn't the instrument that deceived him. The captain read it the way he was used to reading a completely different one. And that habit cost everyone on board their lives. To understand how this is even possible, you have to figure out exactly what the captain saw on the instrument panel an instant before the world flipped over in his eyes. This machine had a long biography long before that night in Perm. This Boeing 737-500, factory designation 737-505, registration Victor Papa Bravo Kilo Oscar, rolled off the assembly line in 1992 and changed hands several times. First, it carried passengers for China's Xiamen Airlines. Then it drifted from one operator to another. And only in May of 2008, a few months before the crash, did Aeroflot Nord take it on lease from a Dublin firm called Pine Watch Limited, a Western airplane flying under a Russian flag. That matters more than it seems. Boeings were built to the American School of Engineering, their own cockpit logic, their own instruments. For pilots who grew up on Soviet equipment, a lot of it was unfamiliar. Different indicators, a different layout, different reflexes that the instruments demanded of the hands and the eyes. This machine also had a chronic ailment. The autothrottle, the system that holds the engines at the required setting on its own, worked unreliably. The crew regularly had to manage thrust by hand, and the levers for the left and right engines often drifted apart, stopping moving in sync. Extra manual fiddling, and right where attention matters most, on the descent and the approach. In itself, the airplane was airworthy. The investigation would later find no catastrophic failure in it that would explain the crash. But an airworthy machine is not yet a safe flight. A Western airliner with unfamiliar logic and a temperamental throttle demanded hands that were used to it specifically. Hands that, under stress, wouldn't slide back to the old Soviet habits. But did this crew have such hands? And how many hours had they actually spent in this cockpit? In the captain's seat that night sat Rodion Medvedev, 34 years old, still young by the standards of civil aviation. On the Boeing 737, he had about 1,190 hours of flight time, but only 452 of those as captain. His captaincy experience on this type was very small, and it's the captain who carries the final decision, and he had accumulated very few such decisions behind him. Beside him, in the right seat, was First Officer Rustem Aliberdin, 43 years old. His flight time was substantial, more than 8,700 hours, except only about 219 of them were on the Boeing. He'd spent almost his entire flying life on Soviet machines, the Tupolev 134, the Antonov 2. A different school, a different cockpit, different habits of the hands and the eyes. The pairing was an uneasy one. A captain with thin command experience, a first officer who was seasoned but barely knew this airplane. Both were still learning the Western equipment, and in both of them, deeply ingrained Soviet reflexes were sitting and waiting. The most troubling part surfaced only during the investigation. The document certifying that part of the retraining on the new type had been completed turned out to be unreliable, simply put, partly falsified. On paper, the courses were done. The clearances were in order. The crew was ready. In reality, their preparation for the peculiarities of the Western cockpit remained incomplete, and those peculiarities were critical. So paper and life converged on a single point. On paper, an ordinary certified crew of an ordinary airline. In reality, two men flying equipment they knew worse than a nighttime landing in cloud required. And between those schools of piloting hid a single difference. It was enough to lead to disaster. The attitude indicator. The instrument on which this whole story turns. A small indicator in the center of the panel, it shows the airplane's position in space, whether it's banked, whether the nose is pitched up, whether it's flying level. By day, in clear weather, the pilot sees the real horizon through the glass and checks himself against it. But at night, in thick cloud, when there's black murk outside the window and not a single line, the attitude indicator is the only thing that knows which way is up and which way is down. Without it, the pilot is literally blind. And right here is where the trap is hidden. The Soviet and the Western schools draw the attitude indicator differently. In the Soviet one, the little aircraft silhouette moves. It tilts left and right the same way the actual machine banks, as if you were watching it from the outside. The pilot judges the bank by how his little aircraft has rolled. On the Western Boeing, it's the other way around. The silhouette is fixed in the center and doesn't move, and the background tilts around it, the horizon line, as if the pilot were looking out at the world from inside the cockpit itself. To read the bank, you have to watch how the background has rolled, not the little aircraft. The logic of bank turns out to be mirror image to the one the Soviet pilot is used to. As long as a person is calm and collected, he remembers which instrument is in front of him, and he reads it correctly. But under stress, under high load, with no visible horizon, the brain falls back on the oldest, most ingrained skill, and it reads the Western attitude indicator by the Soviet habit, backwards. In that mirror image, the mind was buried. The instrument worked flawlessly and showed the truth. The trouble is that the truth can be read back to front if the eye has been trained for something else. All that was left was to wait for the habit to misfire. The final minutes before the crash. The airplane is on the landing course. All around is night and solid cloud. There is no natural horizon beyond the glass at all. The crew has only the instruments and the controller's voice in their headsets. The controller is watching the flight's blip on his screen, and he sees something that should put him on guard. The airplane is drifting right of the localizer beam, the invisible line along which the machine is supposed to track precisely to the runway. He gives a correction, prompts them to turn back onto course. So far, this is a working situation. It happens, and it's usually fixed without trouble. And then, something strange. Instead of descending toward the runway, the airplane climbs. The altitude is increasing where it's supposed to be lost. The controller sees this in his own data and asks again. The flight is climbing. Confirm what's going on with you. There's alarm in his voice now. the picture on the screen doesn't match what an aircraft on approach should be doing. By procedure, the flight should be holding at 600 meters in order to descend gently toward the ground afterward. But instead, the blip is creeping toward 900 and higher. The machine isn't going down to the runway, it's climbing into the cloud, away from the landing path. For the man on the ground, this is already a clear distress signal. The crew has lost the thread of the approach, didn't turn where they should have, didn't descend when they should have, went the wrong way on altitude. The controller does everything he can. He prompts, he checks, he queries. But he can't see what the pilots see on their own instruments, and he can't step into their cockpit. One question remained unanswered. Did the pilots themselves, in those seconds, understand that they were doing the completely wrong thing? A botched approach is not yet a disaster. It's a standard, well-rehearsed situation. If the landing isn't coming together, the crew goes around, climbs, and approaches again. And that's the decision. Flight 821 is going around for a second approach. The decision is correct and safe. The trouble is the state in which the airplane goes around. The autopilot is off. The autothrottle, that same temperamental system, isn't working either. The machine is entirely in the pilot's hands. There's no assistant to hold the bank, keep the course and the engine setting. Everything rests on the attention of two people. And here, that old ailment of the airplane unfolds. With the autothrottle dead, the captain himself spreads and pulls together the engine levers, holding the setting by hand. Extra load, an extra channel of attention taken away from flying. And right now, flying needs to be done with special focus. Thick cloud all around, not a single reference, not a light, not a line of horizon. The airplane climbs. The altitude drifts toward 1,300 meters. The deeper into the cloud, the fewer any prompts from outside. What remains is the instrument panel. All of the captain's attention is pulled to it, and above all, to the attitude indicator, the only thing that can now tell him whether the machine is flying level. And here is that very moment. The man at the controls, who grew up on Soviet equipment, under mounting stress, with no visible horizon, stares into the Western instrument. It honestly shows the airplane's position, but the captain has to read it correctly, and the correct reading here is the opposite of what his eyes and hands are trained for. The instrument's foreign logic turns from an abstract peculiarity into the decisive factor. The only question is what the attitude indicator showed the captain, and what the captain saw instead. As it climbs, the machine begins to bank onto one wing. At first, just a little, an ordinary deviation that the pilot should notice on the instrument and immediately level out. But the bank doesn't go away, it grows. The flight recorders, decoded later, will show the airplane is rolling ever more vigorously over its left wing. And here, you can see the heart of the tragedy. The captain works the controls, but he works them the wrong way. The control wheel doesn't kill the bank, it deepens it. The captain seems to be correcting the position, only in the opposite direction, and drives the machine into the bank even deeper. The classic fingerprint of that mirror reading. A person sees the tilt, interprets it backwards, and counters toward the side you must never counter. With every second, the left wing drops lower. The airplane, which was supposed to be calmly climbing before its second approach, falls away. There's no external horizon beyond the glass. There's an instrument the pilot is reading backwards, and his own sense of balance, which, in the darkness and the cloud, deceives no less than the instrument. The bank reaches its limit. The airplane goes into a full roll, 360 degrees over the left wing. For a moment, the machine is almost wheels up. This is no longer an approach or a go-around. This is a total loss of spatial orientation. In those seconds, the crew simply doesn't understand where the sky is and where the ground is. You can't calmly level out from an inverted position. The nose drops. The airplane breaks into a steep dive. The altitude, so hard won in the cloud, burns away in seconds, now toward the ground. The breakdown unfolded so fast that there was almost no chance to intervene, not for the crew, not for the controller on the ground. At around 10 minutes past 5 in the morning, the fall ended in an impact with the ground. The airplane struck the surface beside the line of the Trans-Siberian Railway, not far from residential districts of Perm. The machine was in a steep dive, and no one could have survived an impact like that. All 88 people on board were killed, 82 passengers and 6 crew members, not a single survivor. Among the dead was Colonel General Gennady Troshev, formerly a troop commander and an advisor to the president, known for his service in the North Caucasus. His name would later sound in every news bulletin, and because of him, the disaster would draw even greater attention. The crash came down right next to the rails. The impact and the fire damaged the track of the Trans-Siberian, one of the country's main transport arteries. Train traffic on the section was halted, while rescuers and investigators worked at the scene. The main line, along which dozens of trains run every day, fell still for a time. The hardest thing about this whole tragedy is how fast it happened. One moment the flight was making a normal approach to the runway. The controller was giving ordinary corrections, and the next, wreckage is burning on the ground by the railway. Perm woke to the news that the Moscow flight had not landed at the airport. Emergency services converged on the crash site. The first, still contradictory rumors spread through the city. And in Moscow, they already understood. It wasn't just a flight that had been lost. A well-known man had died, and this would be one of the loudest air investigations of recent years. While the wreckage still smoldered at the scene, the main question lay ahead. The airplane was sound, the weather tolerable, the crew certified. So what happened in the cockpit in those final minutes? The answer would have to be sought in the black boxes, the flight recorders that survived the impact. The investigation was led by the Interstate Aviation Committee, the MAK, the main authority on air disasters in this part of the world. The airplane was of Western build, so the Americans joined in. The National Transportation Safety Board, the United States Aviation Authorities, and Boeing itself as the maker of the machine. For crashes of Western airliners, an international team is the norm. The investigators started with the obvious. When an apparently sound airplane rolls over and falls, the first thing you check is the hardware. Did a component fail? Was there a fire on board? Did icing get in the way? Did the weather let them down? Each theory has to be either confirmed or honestly closed out. The picture came together step by step. The wreckage and the recording showed, right up to the impact, the airplane was responding to its controls. No in-flight structural breakup, no control jam that would explain the loss of control. The machine did what the control surfaces commanded. The whole question is what exactly was being commanded. The engines didn't let them down either. By the recordings they were running, and the investigation found no fatal in-flight fire capable of bringing the airliner down. The weather was difficult, night, cloud, but within the limits in which airplanes fly and land every day. Icing as a cause wasn't confirmed either, so the theories of pure hardware failure fell away one after another. The airplane didn't break up, didn't catch fire, didn't stall out, didn't ice up to the point of being uncontrollable. It was sound, and that's exactly what made what happened even stranger. And since the machine was airworthy, the needle of the investigation swung toward where the last and main factor remained, into the cockpit, to the actions of the crew. They had to understand not what broke, but what the people did, and above all, why. The recorders reconstructed the final minutes, second by second. The trajectory came out unambiguous. A climb, a bank, a growing bank, a full roll over the left wing, and a break into a dive toward the ground. The airplane didn't jolt from a failure. It rolled smoothly and inexorably to one side. The key thing came from the records of the control inputs. They confirmed what would later add up into the picture. The controls were going against the bank in the wrong sense, and each correction drove the machine deeper. That is, the imprint of an error of perception, not a failure of metal. The investigation tied the picture directly to the reversed display of the Western attitude indicator. The captain, trained on the Soviet logic of the instrument, under stress and with no visible horizon, read the indicator the way he had been taught to read a completely different one, and countered the bank the wrong way. And loss of spatial orientation stops being a dry phrase from a report. It's literal. The person in the cockpit stopped sensing how the airplane stood in space, banked, pitched, inverted. In darkness and cloud, when the only reliable reference is the instrument, a misread instrument takes away the very foundation, the awareness of your own position. That's where the core of the cause lies. Not a bomb, not metal fatigue, not a storm. A sound, honestly working instrument, and a person who wasn't ready to read it correctly at the critical moment. What let them down wasn't the reading, but the form in which it was presented, foreign to the captain's eye. But disorientation rarely comes alone. Behind it, in the investigation's materials, other layers showed through, the things that had been wearing the crew down long before the fatal bank. The first thing the MAK noted besides the disorientation was the captain's condition before takeoff. There had been little rest. The man came to the night flight tired. And fatigue strikes at exactly what let them down that night, at attention, at the speed of perception, at the ability under stress to read instruments correctly and not fall back on old reflexes. The second layer was the interaction in the cockpit. In modern aviation, the first officer isn't a passive helper. He watches the captain, catches mistakes, and intervenes when necessary. Here, that mechanism didn't work. Coordination was weak, and the first officer didn't break the situation when the machine was already rolling into a bank. The two people in the cockpit didn't come together into a team capable of catching each other's mistakes. And the third, most disputed factor. Forensic examination found ethanol in the captain's tissues, traces of alcohol. The estimates from different samples diverged. Some pointed to a mild degree, others to a moderate one. Because of that spread, the factor was contested. There was a lot of argument. But in the end, it was officially entered into the report as a contributing circumstance. The proportion matters. Even by the investigation's conclusions, alcohol was not the main cause. The main link remained the loss of spatial orientation. Put it all together, and what emerges is not a single fatal detail, but a layering. Insufficient training for the Western cockpit, a mirror image instrument, fatigue, a weak team, disputed but recorded alcohol. Each circumstance on its own might still have been forgiven. Together, they lined up in a single row. This is exactly the Swiss cheese model. A disaster happens when the holes in the different layers of defense suddenly line up and something passes straight through them. On that Perm night, the holes lined up. What remained was to formulate the main thing, what the investigation named as the immediate cause, and what was only the background against which it played out. The investigation's final wording goes like this. The immediate cause is the crew's loss of spatial orientation, and above all, the captain's, who was flying on the approach and the go-around. The man at the controls stopped correctly understanding the machine's position, and with his own hands drove it into a bank, and then into a roll. Behind the immediate cause stand the systemic ones. The main one? The crew was insufficiently trained for the Western equipment, specifically for the reversed bank display on the Boeing's attitude indicator. Pilots of the Soviet school were never truly retrained to read the foreign instrument in a way that the skill wouldn't fail under stress. And on top of that, the unreliable retraining documents, because of which the unreadiness went unnoticed. Add the contributing factors already discussed: a weak team in the cockpit, the captain's fatigue, the extra manual labor caused by the faulty autothrottle, and the disputed but officially recorded alcohol. Not one of them on its own was a death sentence. The death sentence was their coincidence. And here's an honest distinction worth stating out loud. The airplane was sound. The engines ran, the structure held, the controls responded right up to the impact. The machine didn't kill the passengers. It was driven into the ground by a chain of human and organizational failures. It wasn't the hardware that let them down. It was the system that let down. The system that allowed onto a nighttime landing in cloud a crew that wasn't ready for its own cockpit. That's why Perm became not just the tragedy of a single flight, but a mirror for an entire industry. It showed what happens when Soviet pilots transfer en masse to Western airplanes, while the retraining stays a formality. That mirror image instrument, on which the captain of 821 stumbled, was sitting in hundreds of other cockpits. And the main question after Perm wasn't who's to blame, but what will be done about it, so that the mirror trap wouldn't spring again in some other night sky. The first tangible change was the fate of the airline itself. Aeroflot Nord, under whose flag the crashed aircraft had flown, changed its name as early as 2009, becoming Nordavia, and years later, Smartavia. After a disaster like that, it's a common thing. A brand tied to the deaths of 88 people is hard to carry forward. More importantly, the disaster shifted the very system of pilot training. The investigation loudly showed the mass transition of former Soviet crews onto Western airplanes cannot be handled on paper. Retraining programs began to be reviewed with an emphasis on real mastery of the foreign cockpit, rather than a formal sign-off. Special attention was paid to the very thing on which it all fell apart, to the difference between the schools of instrumentation and to flying without a visible horizon. Recovery from unusual attitudes, reading the Western attitude indicator, the actions in a total loss of orientation at night and in cloud, all of this began to be taken far more seriously. Oversight was tightened too, so that courses would actually be completed rather than drawn up on paper, and so that the medical clearance for a flight would be genuine. Behind all these dry conclusions remain the 88 people who never reached Perm that September morning. Their deaths were not the bad luck of a single flight. They laid bare a weak spot common to many cockpits. The ending here is honest, and for that reason, heavy. A technically airworthy airplane crashed not where the hardware failed, but where the training and the human failed. The instrument showed the truth, and it was read backwards. And one question remains without a precise answer. How many times did that same mirror image attitude indicator come within a breath of repeating Perm in other night cockpits, where the crew did, after all, manage to understand in time where the sky was and where the ground was? An hour before departure, the taxi driver realized something. He had just delivered a drunk man to an aircraft. Slurred speech, glassy eyes, movements out of sync, and the uniform of an airline captain. On the 13th of January, 1977, in fog-bound Anchorage, a cargo Douglas DC-8 belonging to a Japanese airline, Flight 8054, would crash within seconds of leaving the ground. 5 people on board. A captain with 23,000 hours in his logbook would stall a perfectly sound aircraft right after takeoff, as if he were sitting in a cockpit for the very first time. The autopsy would later produce a figure that's hard to believe. And yet, the heart of this story isn't the alcohol in his blood. It's the silence of all those who saw everything and could have stopped the flight with a single word. The 13th of January, 1977, around 5 in the morning. Anchorage, Alaska, the dead of polar winter. It's freezing outside, the airport is drowning in thick fog, and the few lights by the terminal dissolve into a white haze. Along the icy road toward the cargo area of the international airport, a taxi is making its way. Inside is the flight crew of a Japanese airline, due today to fly a heavy cargo jet across the ocean. The driver has carried pilots before, and is used to calm, composed people in uniform. But this morning, one of his passengers worries him. The captain is acting strangely. His movements are out of sync, as if his body barely obeys him. His face is flushed, his eyes are cloudy, as though covered by a film. When he tries to say something, the words come out jumbled and almost incoherent. They pile up on one another, the sentences fall apart. By the end of the short ride, the driver no longer has any doubt. Something is seriously wrong with this man. At the terminal, the captain struggles to climb out of the car. He can barely even stand. You can't write that off as tiredness or the early hour. He has just delivered to an aircraft a man in a state that doesn't square with the word pilot at all. At around 4:50 in the morning, the driver reports all of this to the dispatcher at the taxi company. The dispatcher does what seems the only right thing. He calls the airport's ground service and says plainly that a drunk captain of a Japanese airline is on his way to a flight. The warning has been sounded. There's still more than an hour before the engines start. For now, the disaster can be stopped with a single phone call. And out in the fog, the machine was already waiting for the crew. The flight was designated Japan Airlines 8054, a cargo run. From Anchorage, it was to continue, with a fuel stop, toward Japan. On the ramp stood a 4-engine Douglas DC-862F, registration JA-8054, with Pratt & Whitney engines, a big, reliable airliner, proven over years of service. The cargo this time was unusual. In the hold, they were carrying live breeding cattle, bound for Japan. 2 stockmen were looking after the animals during the flight. Their job was to keep the cattle calm through the long journey. Together with the flight crew, that made 5 people on board: the captain, the first officer, the flight engineer, and the two handlers. In the left-hand seat, the captain's seat, sat a man whose name the entire world of aviation safety would soon come to know. Hugh Marsh, 53 years old, an American. He had joined the Japanese airline in 1969, and over the years he had logged more than 23,000 hours, thousands of them on the DC-8. On paper, a distinguished pilot, one trusted without hesitation, with a heavy aircraft and valuable cargo. On the ground, everything looked routine. A familiar route, a familiar aircraft, an ordinary cargo departure, of which the company had flown hundreds. Nothing in the schedule hinted at trouble. And yet, between the taxi's arrival and the start of the engines, an invisible crack was already spreading, the kind that within a few minutes would turn an ordinary flight into one of the darkest pages in the company's history. The driver's alarm traveled on down the chain. The signal from the taxi dispatcher reached the airport's contracted technical service at around 6:20 in the morning. The right word had been spoken in the right place, or so it seemed. But this is exactly where the warning dissolved. The agent who took the message reasoned it out his own way. He decided that the Japanese airline had plenty of its own people on site, that they would notice if something was wrong and would not let the flight go. The responsibility seemed to flow on to someone closer to the crew. The signal never turned into action anywhere. It was noted, passed along, and not a single lever was pulled. Those who really were near the crew would later assure investigators that they had noticed nothing unusual. Both the airline's dispatchers and the relief crew that had flown in and handed the aircraft over would say in one voice, everything went smoothly, the pre-flight briefing was uneventful, the captain gave them no cause for suspicion at all, and the testimony splits in two. When those who had seen Marsh in the hours before the flight were later questioned, 6 of the 13 recalled signs of drinking, his behavior, the smell. But 5 close acquaintances, on the contrary, noticed absolutely nothing. One of the company car drivers even said the captain had been in decent shape, no worse than he had ever seen him. So on the ground a strange picture took shape. One man raised the alarm, a second muffled it, and a dozen others either saw nothing or thought nothing of it. The emergency brake was within reach of many. In the end, no one dared to pull it. In the cockpit, meanwhile, ordinary work was going on. At around 6:09, the crew began the pre-start checks. The checklists were read off in their usual order. The responses came back by the book. From the outside, it all looked like the most ordinary departure. The first crack showed during taxi. The heavy DC-8 rolled toward the start and lined up on the wrong runway. Instead of 24 left, the crew brought the aircraft out to the parallel 24 right. The controller caught the error and corrected the course. But instead of a brief acknowledgement from the cockpit came an objection. The captain began arguing with the controller, as if he couldn't immediately grasp what was happening. Finding himself on 24 right, Marsh swung the many-ton airliner right there on the runway. A full 180-degree turn to find the taxiway he needed. For a bulky cargo aircraft, that maneuver is difficult and rare in itself. And here, it came out of plain confusion over the runways. In the end, communication and order were restored. The controller guided the aircraft to the correct start, and the crew lined up on runway 24 left. At 6:33, at a moment in time that investigators would later parse down to the second, Flight 8054 reported ready for takeoff. Each of these little hiccups, taken alone, is easy to dismiss as a trifle, turned the wrong way, argued with the controller, who hasn't, in the small hours and thick fog. But laid alongside the taxi driver's account, the picture reads differently. These weren't random slips of routine, but the first outward symptoms of a man at the controls who had poor command of both the machine and himself. But the pilot wasn't the only danger that morning. The weather over Anchorage had turned treacherous. Fog, damp, cold air, a temperature hovering near zero, the very combination airmen dread. In such conditions, ice builds up unnoticed, and the trouble is that it often simply can't be seen with the eye. The ground technicians inspecting the aircraft did spot ice, but on the engines. They saw frost on the inlet guide vanes, on the engine cowlings, on the nose cones of the nacelles. One of the mechanics even directly advised switching on the engine anti-ice system to clear the threat. On the lifting surfaces, though, on the wings, no one officially recorded any ice. The airline staff, by their own account, saw no ice on the aircraft at all. But the absence of a record of ice didn't mean the wing was clean. Investigators would later work through the subtle physics of that morning. After refueling, the tanks held very cold fuel, and the metal of the wing was deeply chilled, and all around hung a fog of the tiniest supercooled droplets of water, the kind that stay liquid even below freezing, but turn to ice the instant they touch a cold surface. Time passed between the pre-flight inspection and takeoff. And in those minutes, supercooled moisture from the fog could well have settled on the frozen wing, building up in a thin, almost transparent layer of frost. Such a coating doesn't catch the eye. It's easy to miss in the darkness and damp of a polar morning. But even an invisible rough film on the wing means lost lift and a reduced margin of safety in the air. The mechanic's advice to switch on the engine heat was never carried out, and just how much lift the frost on the wings was quietly devouring, at that moment, no one knew. The aircraft stood still at the head of the runway, ready for the start. At 34 minutes and 32 seconds past 6, the captain called maximum power. The 4 engines spooled up to takeoff thrust, and the DC-8 began its run down runway 24 left, slicing through the fog with its lights. From there, everything followed the cockpit voice recorder, second by second. 20 seconds in, the first officer called 80 knots. A few moments later, at 35 minutes and 10 seconds, came V1, the very decision, speed past which a takeoff is no longer aborted. The point of no return had been crossed. At 35 minutes and 16 seconds came the command to raise the nose, and it was acknowledged. The captain pulled the control column toward himself, and he pulled it sharply. Later, calculations would show that Marsh hauled the nose up very steeply, to about 15 degrees right after liftoff. For an overloaded cargo jet in slippery conditions, that was dangerously aggressive handling. At 35 minutes and 21 seconds, the first officer called V2, the safe climb speed at which the aircraft should be climbing confidently. The machine left the runway roughly 3 seconds after the nose began to rise. But something about this takeoff didn't add up. The acceleration from rotation speed to V2 was sluggish, noticeably delayed. The interval between the calls turned out to be about 1.5 seconds longer than on a normal takeoff of the same DC-8 in this company. 1.5 seconds sounds like nothing, but on takeoff, it's an eternity. The aircraft was climbing into the sky both too steeply and too slowly at once, and that is exactly the combination a wing cannot tolerate. The reckoning came almost instantly. At 35 minutes and 26 seconds, a new sound appeared in the cockpit. A growing vibration, a shudder that the recorder picked up right after liftoff. For a pilot, that is the first and most honest signal. The wing is at its limit. The stall is a fraction of a second away. The nose, meanwhile, kept rising higher. The angle of attack, the angle at which the wing meets the oncoming airflow, climbed to about 18 degrees. That's already the region where a normal wing stops holding the aircraft up, and a wing touched by frost gives out even sooner. The airliner had managed to reach only about 280 feet, less than 90 meters above the runway. The reaction in the cockpit came too late. Only at 35 minutes and 33 seconds did the flight engineer say the alarmed words "too steep," an attempt to tell the captain the nose was raised excessively. A few seconds later, at 35 minutes and 38, the engineer was already shouting, "Stall!" Almost at the same moment, the automatics kicked in. The stick shaker activated, the mechanical stall warning. But the technology failed at the moment it was needed most. The stall warning, which was supposed to alert the crew in advance, came catastrophically late. It switched on only about a second before the impact with the ground. Instead of a margin of time to correct things, the pilot got the warning at the very moment there was nothing left to correct. So, within mere seconds, 3 disasters converged at once. The supercooled wing, having lost part of its lift, the over-raised nose, which carried the aircraft past the edge of a stall, and the late warning, which robbed the crew of their last chance to lower the nose in time. The heavy cargo DC-8 hung in the air for an instant, and broke away. A man on the ground saw all of it. An eyewitness watched the lights of the climbing airliner rise into the fog to about 100 feet above the ground. The machine was going up, and then everything went wrong. The aircraft wobbled, banked to the left, and, in the witness's words, seemed to slide out of the air and down. It didn't drop like a stone. It slipped off the invisible support it had only just been resting on. There is a precise mechanics behind this. The overpulled wing, taken past the stall angle, lost its lift all at once. One half of the wing dropped a little before the other, hence the bank to the left. The nose fell, the airliner lost control, and the crew had neither the altitude nor the time left to correct it. At 35 minutes and 39 seconds past 6, the recorder captured the impact with the ground. From the command to raise the nose to that second, a little more than 20 seconds had passed. From the liftoff itself, only an instant. The heavy Douglas DC-8 crashed near the airfield and was completely destroyed. All 5 on board were killed. The captain, the first officer, the flight engineer, and the 2 stockmen, no one survived. A routine cargo flight that should have departed calmly across the ocean ended in the first seconds of flight, barely off the runway. From the outside, what had happened looked inexplicable. A sound, modern airliner, one of the company's most experienced pilots in the captain's seat, a short takeoff at a familiar airport, and through all of it, an instant, almost beginner's stall right after liftoff, the kind you would never expect from a man with 23,000 hours. What had driven such a pilot to an elementary mistake on takeoff was now for the investigators to work out, not the controllers, not the eyewitnesses. The case was taken up by the National Transportation Safety Board of the United States, the independent agency that, in America, investigates the causes of air crashes. And right away, the investigators ran into that same incompatibility of details that logic couldn't piece together. The black boxes at first only deepened the bewilderment. The flight data recorder showed a clean, normal run down the runway, and then a sharp, premature climb with the nose pitched up. The aircraft had stalled almost immediately after reaching safe climb speed. The machine seemed to forget it had just accelerated and dropped away. The logic of the investigation first led down a technical trail. The prime suspect became ice. The morning had been foggy and cold. The mechanics had seen frost on the engines, and the way the aircraft behaved under icing could well explain an early breakaway. Investigators seriously examined exactly how ice on the wing and in the systems might have wrecked the takeoff. But beside it lay a detail impossible to skirt. That very call from the taxi dispatcher about a drunk captain and the oddities during taxi. All of this pointed not at metal and not at weather, but at the man. The investigation had to test a terrible hypothesis head-on. If the captain's behavior really had been as the driver described, the answer wouldn't come from the recorder, but from medical examination. And the question narrowed to one. What would the autopsy show of the man who had sat that morning in the left seat? The medical examination gave an answer that left no room for doubt. The alcohol content in the captain's blood was 298 milligrams per 100 milliliters. In familiar terms, that's almost 3 per meal. That is, roughly 3 times the level at which in Alaska, a person is forbidden even to get behind the wheel of a car, let alone the controls of an airliner. A second test, performed 12 hours later on the vitreous fluid of the eye, gave an even higher figure, 310. At such a concentration of alcohol, the body works with gross malfunctions. A person becomes confused, loses coordination, and their sense of position in space suffers, the very sense without which a pilot cannot fly an aircraft precisely. These were exactly the signs the taxi driver had described several hours earlier, without understanding it himself. The first officer and the flight engineer, meanwhile, turned out to be sober. The examination found no signs of intoxication in them. Only one man on board was drunk, and it was the one who held the controls and made the decisions, the captain. Now the scattered oddities of that morning lined up into a single thread, the slurred speech and out-of-sync movements in the taxi, the argument with the controller and the lineup on the wrong runway, the clumsy turn on the runway, the over-steep beginner's pitch-up on takeoff, the sluggish delayed reactions that stretched the takeoff out by extra seconds. This was no longer a set of random slips by an experienced pilot. Step by step, heavy intoxication was breaking through to the surface. There remained, however, a technical question. The alcohol explained why the captain had acted wrongly. But why did one very specific error, too sharp a pitch-up, turn into a stall rather than just a rough takeoff? Here the ice came into play once more. At the same time, the investigation did not lay all the blame on the bottle. The board stated plainly, icing also played its part and worsened the outcome. Alcohol and ice didn't work separately, but in tandem, reinforcing each other. The mechanism was this. A thin layer of frost on the wing changes its aerodynamics. A rough, uneven surface breaks the airflow sooner than a smooth one, which means the wing reaches a stall at a lower angle of attack than usual. Put simply, the margin to a stall that a clean wing would still have had was already eaten away on the iced one. The machine gave up sooner than it would have under normal conditions. To this were added the small things that were missed. The engine heat the mechanic had advised switching on was never touched by anyone, and the stall warning system, late by that fatal second, could have failed for several reasons at once. Ice on the sensitive sensor, the altered characteristics of an iced wing, an imprecise setting. One way or another, the automatics did not warn the crew in advance, as they should have. In the end, it all came together. The drunk pilot pitched the nose up steeper than normal and reacted late. The iced wing did not forgive that error and broke away ahead of time. The late warning gave not a single second to correct it. Each factor on its own might not have been fatal, but together they lined up into a flawless chain. And yet, through all this technology, the main question kept showing through. One not about ice and not about sensors. Too many people that morning saw that something was wrong with the captain. Why did not one of them stop the flight while it was still on the ground, while the aircraft stood in the fog and several calm minutes still separated it from disaster? The most uncomfortable part of the entire investigation turned out to be exactly this answer. The matter wasn't about a single drunk man, but also about those who stayed silent beside him. Inside the cockpit, the flight engineer did, after all, raise the alarm. But his too steep came only seconds before impact, when the aircraft was already falling. The first officer in the right-hand seat, by every sign, saw the captain's condition, and yet did not stop the takeoff, did not take the controls, did not abort the flight. The voice of the subordinates came too late and too quietly. The board said this plainly, without mincing words. Investigators pointed out, it is extremely hard for subordinate crew members to challenge a captain's decision, even when the captain himself has become a threat to flight safety. Two forces converged here, a rigid chain of command where the captain's word is almost beyond question, and a cultural norm in which a junior in rank does not contradict a senior or go into open conflict. And there had been more than enough chances to stop the flight. The taxi driver wasn't heated, the ground agent put his hope in someone else's eyes, the relief crew and the dispatchers weren't alarmed, and in the cockpit itself, the first officer and the flight engineer held out until the final seconds. Each one thought it was someone else who ought to step in. And so, a system came together in which almost anyone could have stopped the flight, and no one did. Any single link can be understood, even excused, but added together, they yield the most bitter lesson of this disaster. Sometimes an aircraft is destroyed not by a failure of technology and not by one man at the controls, but by the silence of everyone else around him. The final word was set down by the official report, released in 1978, about a year and a half after the crash. The wording of the cause sounded restrained and merciless at once. The probable cause was named as a stall brought on by the pilot's actions and aggravated by airframe icing while the pilot was under the influence of alcohol. As a contributing factor, it noted separately that the other crew members did not prevent the captain's attempt to make the flight. That dry line held the whole tragedy. A drunk man at the controls, invisible frost on the wing, late automatics, and a cockpit where no one said stop in time. In the history of flight safety, this disaster holds a special place. In major airlines, alcohol is very rarely acknowledged as a direct cause, which makes every such case all the heavier and more striking. Flight 8054 became just such a rare and therefore unforgettable example. No experience, no 20,000 hours of flight time will save you if a person sits down at the controls in a state like that. But the main lesson of this story lay not even in the permila, but in the silence of the right-hand seat and the swallowed warning on the ground. The investigation brought to light what had stayed in the shadows for years, how dearly this muteness of those beside the captain costs. In time, it would be disasters like this one that reshaped the very philosophy of crew work. The captain's unconditional authority would give way to a culture of cooperation, where everyone in the cockpit has not only the right, but the direct duty to intervene if a flight is heading toward catastrophe. The story of Flight 8054 leaves behind one heavy question that reaches far beyond aviation. Where is the line passed? which cautious silence stops being tact and becomes complicity. He held the best paperwork in town, an airline transport pilot certificate, a helicopter rating, 2,700 hours in the sky, and in his blood, almost 6 times more alcohol than a pilot is ever allowed to carry. The 4th of August, 2019, a clear Sunday evening in Alaska. From a tiny strip just outside Girdwood, an old 4-seat Piper lifts off. On board are 4 men, and ahead of them lie the mountains and the glaciers. 15 minutes later, the plane will slam into a sheer cliff just 15 feet below the summit. The engine doesn't quit. The weather doesn't turn. So, how did a man with that much experience fly the people who trusted him straight into a mountain? And why did no one on the ground stop him? Southern Alaska, the south of the state. The town of Girdwood sits about an hour from Anchorage, in a narrow valley hemmed in on every side by mountains. In summer, it barely gets dark before midnight. The sky that day is clear, the visibility excellent, the kind of weather a pilot can only dream of. On the edge of town, there's a small gravel airfield with the code AQY. The runway is short, squeezed between steep slopes and the waters of Turnagain Arm. No big aircraft is landing here. But in Alaska, the main form of air travel is the small private plane, and there are hundreds of strips like this across the state. 4 men walk toward one of the aircraft. Waiting for them is a Piper PA-22150 Tri-Pacer, a tiny 4-seat machine with a high wing and fixed landing gear, a classic of American light aviation. The type was built back in the 50s, when Pipers like this rolled off the line by the thousand. Generations of Americans learned to fly on this airplane, simple and forgiving, with almost nothing in it to break. Nobody files a flight plan for the evening, and nobody needs to. It's a pleasure flight. Climb above the valley and look down on the glaciers and snowy peaks that ring Girdwood on every side. No controller, no schedule. Just an ordinary Alaskan joyride through the air, the kind that happens dozens of times on a fine day. The plane is sound. The sky is clear. At the controls is a man with serious flying experience. From the outside, this is a safe flight on one of the best evenings of the short northern summer, which makes it all the harder to believe that 15 minutes after takeoff, all 4 men now walking toward the plane will be dead. The pilot's name is Charles Weimer, and he is 31 years old. A local, he had lived in Alaska for 6 years, and he had spent all of them flying over the very valleys and glaciers that surround Girdwood. For a man his age, the resume is almost a model one. On paper, Weimer is the elite of light aviation. He holds an airline transport pilot certificate, the highest grade of pilot license, the kind usually carried by the captains of scheduled airliners. Add to that a helicopter rating, commercial pilot privileges for single and multi-engine airplanes, and an instrument rating. And on top of all that, he is a certified flight instructor, a man trusted to teach others. Behind him are around 2,700 hours of flight time. That's more than some captains who sit down at the controls of a passenger jet. Before aviation, Weimer had served in the Marine Corps, where he was medically discharged after 3 years. Then he got the formal training and went into the sky for good. But out of all those hours, only 40 fall in the last 6 months. In other words, Weimer had hardly been flying lately, and skills go dull without regular practice. Above all, the feel for the machine and the reaction in a tight spot. And one more detail from the investigation changes everything. Weimer was known as a heavy drinker, not one slip, not a one-time thing, but a settled habit that sooner or later was bound to cross paths with his profession. On that Sunday evening, it did. And the man with the best paperwork in town turned out to be the most dangerous person who could have taken the controls that day. Beside Weimer, into the cockpit, climbs the owner of the plane, Carl Erickson, 55 years old, also a Girdwood man. The old Tri-Pacer belongs to him, and he is also the one who put together the group for the evening's flight. Here is what would later become one of the key pieces of evidence. Not long before takeoff, Erickson sends a message to an acquaintance. In that short text, he admits outright he and the pilot are drinking. Not, "we drank the night before," but right before the flight. The owner, in his own words, records what the tests would soon confirm. That message would outlive everyone on board. Besides the pilot and the plane's owner, 2 more men get in. David Osborne, 60 years old, also from Girdwood, and Paul Wiley, 37, who had come up from Arizona, the only one here from out of state. 4 grown men, their gear, full tanks, and all of it in a plane built to carry that load just barely. And this isn't about fatigue after a shift, or about inexperience. The man taking the controls had just been drinking, and he was about to lift 3 people who trusted him into the air over some of the most brutal mountain terrain in North America. Did the passengers know the state of the man who was going to fly them? Ericsson's message tells us the owner of the plane, at the very least, understood it all. He had taken part in the drinking himself. The fatal decision, in other words, was made knowingly, and now it was leading 4 men toward the short runway of AQY. That airfield is unforgiving in its own right. A short strip wedged into a valley, ringed on every side by steep wooded slopes. To take off safely from here, you have to climb fast and confidently, then thread your way carefully between the mountains without clipping a single ridge. Local pilots do it with ease, but only with a clear head and a properly loaded machine. And the Piper was not loaded properly. By the investigators' figures, the Tri-Pacer's takeoff weight came to about 2,048 pounds, roughly 50 pounds over the permitted limit of 2,000. A small overload, but it doesn't pass without a trace. A heavy machine needs more speed to lift off, more runway, and more time to claw its way upward. And around the Girdwood Mountains, the margin of altitude is thin to begin with. Around 4:15 in the afternoon, the old Piper gathers speed down the strip and lifts off the ground. The 150 horsepower engine drags the overloaded machine toward the surrounding ridges. The plane climbs, slower than it would have if it had been lighter. In the mountains, the air plays dirty. Near sheer slopes, downdrafts form, invisible currents that press the plane toward the ground exactly where altitude matters most. To handle them in an overloaded machine, a pilot has to feel power, speed, and every gust of wind with precision. Any hesitation in his reaction, any error in judging the distance to the slope, can be the last one. Alcohol takes away exactly that precision, and it takes it first. A sober pilot needs every last drop of his skill here. The man at the controls of this Piper was no longer fully in command of either the machine or himself. From the ground and from the surrounding slopes, people are watching the plane, and what they see does not look like a calm Sunday outing. The machine is behaving strangely. Instead of a smooth climb along a wide arc, the way the locals usually do it, there are sharp, aggressive maneuvers almost from the moment of takeoff. To an experienced eye, that's an alarming sign. The plane seems to jerk, to change direction in fits and starts. That's how you fly when something has gone wrong on board, or when the man at the controls has lost command of himself. The explanation would come from the forensics. The alcohol content in the pilot's blood was between 0.238 and 0.252, almost 6 times higher than the limit set for crew members. This is severe intoxication, the kind in which a person can barely command his own body. An unsteady gait, slurred speech, crude and clumsy movements. Only here, in that state, was not a pedestrian, but a pilot, flying a machine through 3 dimensions right up against the cliffs. At doses like that, alcohol strikes exactly what is critical in flying near mountains. The eye lies, and the slope looks farther away than it is. Coordination goes, and the hands no longer make precise movements. And the sense of danger fades, so the pilot simply doesn't realize he is rushing toward disaster. In place of cold calculation, there is only drunken confidence in his own abilities. And the Piper, with these ragged figures, heads exactly where it will be least safe of all, straight at a sheer rocky ridge above the glacier, past the open space of the valley with its reserve of altitude and room to maneuver. From the outside, you could see where it was all heading. From the pilot's seat, by all appearances, you no longer could. And here the investigation got lucky. At the foot of the ridge that evening, there happened to be people. On the Eagle Glacier nearby, a group of skiers was training, high-level athletes working on their technique on the summer snow. They became the closest witnesses to the last seconds of the flight. By their account, the plane approached the mountain ridge with its nose pitched up. At some point, the machine pulls into a steep climb, as if the pilot, at the last instant, grasps the danger and hauls the yoke back in desperation, trying to clear the wall of rock. Or, on the contrary, he loses control and pulls the nose up too sharply. From the outside, those 2 scenarios are almost indistinguishable. In the way stands Goat Mountain, its summit rising to 5,512 feet. The slope is sheer and bare, not a single level patch where you could somehow set down. To clear a ridge like that in an overloaded machine with a 150 horsepower engine is a task at the very edge of the possible, even for a sober pilot in perfect form. And the plane falls just barely short. The old Piper strikes the rock 15 feet below the crest of the ridge. 15 feet, less than the length of the plane itself. One more short surge of altitude, a little more thrust or a little less weight, and the machine might have cleared the ridge and gone on into the valley beyond the mountain. But those 15 feet weren't there. There was no reserve of altitude, eaten up by the overload. There was no precision, taken away by intoxication. There was no clear head to turn away in time from the deadly slope, while there was still time and room to do it. Everything that could have saved the four men was missing all at once, and in that final second of flight, the price of a decision made back on the ground came due in a single point near the summit of a goat mountain. The impact lands on the south wall of the mountain, some 5 miles north of the airfield, from which the Piper had lifted off barely 15 minutes before. At full speed, the light machine breaks apart, and a fire starts at the point of impact. The skiers on the glacier see it through to the end. The machine vanishes behind the ridge, and a moment later, a column of smoke rises over that very spot. They don't need to get any closer. It's already clear that there has been a disaster, and there is no one left to help. All four men, pilot Charles Weimer, owner Carl Erickson, David Osborne, and Paul Wiley, are killed. No one had any chance of surviving a crash like that. The Sunday outing, which had begun on a clear, quiet evening, ends on the sheer wall of a mountain, and over the glacier, silence settles once again. Word of the crash brings out the rescuers. A military helicopter is sent to the site. There is no reaching the south wall of Goat Mountain by land. The slope is too steep. From the air, the crew finds what is left of the plane, wreckage scattered across the rocky face high above the glacier. Bringing the bodies down is a trial of its own. The work has to be done on a steep, rocky slope, where every step is risky and there is nowhere for the helicopter to land. For Alaska, this is routine. Even recovering the dead turns into a dangerous mountain operation. But without it, the investigation would have had nothing to hold on to. The case is handled by the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, which examines all serious aviation accidents in the United States. It receives the official number ANC19FA058, where the ANC prefix points to the regional office in Anchorage. It's a familiar task in light aviation. No controller recordings, no recorders of the kind that airliners carry. The picture has to be assembled from wreckage, witness accounts, and what the pilot's body would reveal. The dead are sent for forensic examination, and the blood samples go to the Federal Aviation Administration's specialized laboratory that deals with pilot toxicology. And it is the lab that puts the final period on the case, that same 0.238 to 0.252 of ethanol in Weimer's blood, almost 6 times higher than the permitted threshold of 0.04 for crew members. The figure is official, and it can no longer be disputed. And now that pre-flight message from Erickson takes on the weight of evidence. A confession tossed to an acquaintance that he and the pilot were drinking, lining up exactly with what the blood revealed. The words and the analysis came together, and no doubt remains. In parallel, the investigators work through the other theories too, as you do in any investigation. Could the equipment have failed? The old but well-kept Piper was sound. No sign of engine or control failure was found in the wreckage. Was the weather to blame? It was a clear day with excellent visibility. No storms, no fog, no wind shear that could have suddenly thrown the machine against the slope. One by one, these theories fall away, and everything converges on the state of the man at the controls. But was alcohol the only thing that pushed the plane into the mountain? No, not the only thing. Alongside it stood another factor, that same overload. The extra 50 pounds beyond the 2,000-pound limit don't kill a plane on their own. A Piper that far over can take off and fly. The trouble lay elsewhere. The weak engine was barely pulling the standard load as it was, and for an overloaded machine near a rocky ridge, it failed to give that last surge of altitude that would have decided the outcome. Those same 15 missing feet near the summit of Goat Mountain are, in part, the price of the extra weight. For a sober pilot, weight and mountain currents are known dangers that he accounts for in advance. He calculates the load, steers around the treacherous slopes, keeps a reserve of altitude and speed. But all of that takes a cold head, and Weimer didn't have one that evening. The pairing of intoxication and overestimating your own abilities is an old curse of light aviation the world over. A man who has been drinking feels more confident than he is and takes on things he would never dare sober. Overload, mountain terrain, a shortage of recent practice, each factor is dangerous on its own. But it was intoxication above all that kept the pilot from seeing how they were converging and from backing off in time. What remained was to see how the official investigation would put it all into words. The NTSB's conclusion came out short and merciless. The probable cause of the crash was named as the pilot's alcohol intoxication, which led him to fail to maintain a safe distance from the mountain and to collide with its slope. By the classification, this is what's called controlled flight into terrain, when a fully sound airplane under the control of a living person flies into the landscape simply because the pilot doesn't realize where he's heading. Neither the machine nor the sky had anything to do with it. The only thing that failed was the man holding the yoke. To understand how something like this is even possible, you have to look at Alaska itself. Here, a plane is not a luxury, but everyday transport. The state has almost no roads, many towns are connected to the world only by air, and there are more private pilots per head of population here than anywhere else in the United States. For an Alaskan, a light plane is roughly what a car is to someone on the mainland. People fly it to go fishing, to visit friends, to run errands. But this freedom has a flip side: the harsh terrain, the changeable weather, and the absence of controllers at hundreds of small strips have bred a particular culture of flying at your own risk. A great deal rests not on oversight, but on the personal caution of the pilot. When that caution is in place, the system works for decades. But the same freedom that feeds Alaska and ties it together sometimes releases the internal brakes, and someone takes the controls as carelessly as he might take the wheel after a drinking session. On that Sunday evening near Girdwood, that is exactly what came together. 4 lives ended not because of a failure, not because of a storm, not because of some fatal accident that could not have been foreseen. They ended because of a single decision: to take off drunk. And behind this case, there remains a question with no comforting answer. How many more flights like this over the mountains of Alaska end well only because, that time, someone got lucky? 5,000 hours in the sky, aerobatic ratings, performances at air shows all across the country, and all of it came crashing down into a cornfield in less than a minute, just a few hundred yards from his own airfield. Kansas, July of 2022. A 74-year-old ace, flying an aircraft he had built with his own hands, pulls up dramatically into a vertical climb right after takeoff, and never comes back down. The machine turned out to be perfectly sound. The weather was clear. So what was it that killed a man who knew almost everything there was to know about flying? Investigators didn't find the answer in the wreckage. They found it in his blood. This is the story of how a little bit of drinking in the morning erased an entire lifetime in the sky. On the 16th of July, 2022, around noon, the usual summer heat hangs over the fields of Shawnee County, Kansas. Off to the side of the town of Topeka sits a small private airfield called Buena Terra, a narrow grass strip in the middle of the corn, a personal hangar, no tower, no air traffic controllers, no prying eyes. One man runs the place, and the locals know him on sight. At the controls is Stephen Stuckey, 74 years old, a retired master sergeant of the National Guard, a man people in these parts call a living legend of the sky. He had more than 5,000 flight hours behind him, a commercial pilot's license, and qualifications an average hobbyist can only dream of. He had flown in aerobatic formation, performed at air shows across the country, thrown his aircraft through maneuvers in front of the grandstands, and knew the cockpit the way few people know the back of their own hand. The aircraft beneath him is a light 2-seat Vans RV-7, a nimble little sport machine. And it wasn't something he bought off a showroom floor. Stuckey built it himself, by hand, from a kit of parts. His own sky, his own airfield, his own airplane. The neighbors had long grown used to the sight. Rolls, loops, inverted passes. The old ace showing off his skills once again over the grass strip. That afternoon, everything begins the way it had hundreds of times before. A routine flight by a man who, it seemed, knew everything there was to know about flying. This flight would be his last. Less than a minute after liftoff, the airplane would go down almost on top of the very same strip. First, a word about the machine itself. The RV-7 isn't the product of some big factory. On paper, it's classified as an experimental, amateur-built aircraft, and behind that dry definition stands an entire culture. In the United States, tens of thousands of people build their own airplanes right in their garages. A company sells a kit, crates of aluminum panels, rivets, and blueprints, and from there, a person spends years, evening after evening, building a winged machine on his own. These aren't toys. The finished aircraft goes through inspection and receives a genuine registration number. Stuckey walked that road twice. First, he built a futuristic Very EZ with a pusher propeller, and then this RV-7 with the tail number November 283 Sierra. People love the RV-7 for its character. Light, powerful for its size, responsive, almost an extension of your arm. A machine like that is made for aerobatics. It eagerly rolls onto a wing and follows the stick with ease. But that lightness has a flip side. Low weight and plenty of thrust make the airplane sharp and sensitive to every input. It forgives little and punishes fast. Its owner knew his RV-7 down to the last screw. He built it himself, maintained it himself, flew it himself, and performed in it with the local formation aerobatics team. There were no middlemen between the man and the machine. Complete trust, complete understanding. Only later would that turn out to be part of the trap. My airplane, my sky, my airfield, my comfort zone. Knowing the machine doesn't save you when the pilot himself is the one who fails. Around 11:53 in the morning, the RV-7 taxis onto the dirt strip designated runway 19. The engine spools up smoothly. The light machine quickly picks up speed across the grass and almost effortlessly lifts off the ground. For an aircraft like this and a pilot like this, it's routine. A takeoff that takes mere seconds. Down below, a few witnesses follow the aircraft with their eyes. They know the scene. The ace is back in the air, and something dramatic is about to happen. Stuckey doesn't disappoint. Right after liftoff, he pulls the stick sharply back and points the nose toward the sky. The RV-7 stands almost vertical and shoots upward like a rocket. It's his signature crowd pleaser, a sudden pull into a steep climb straight off the takeoff, without a long run-up in level flight. At an air show, a vertical climb like that draws applause. The machine seems to tear away from the earth and, in a single stroke, soar toward the heavens. Except there's almost no altitude beneath him. The airplane reaches only about 150 to 200 feet. That's roughly 50 to 60 meters above the field. For a maneuver performed right down near the ground, that little margin of height means almost nothing. If something goes wrong, there won't be a single second or a single extra foot left to fix it. And on a steep vertical, physics works without mercy. The airplane climbs, fighting against gravity, and the airspeed bleeds away fast. The air flows worse and worse over the wing. The machine loses momentum, and the invisible edge, the point where the wing stops carrying it, draws nearer with every instant. A vertical climb is beautiful, right up until the moment it runs out of speed. At the very top of the near-vertical climb, the nose of the RV-7, which an instant ago was pointed at the sky, suddenly drops. At the same moment, the machine yaws to the right, and to an aerobatic pilot, that's an unmistakable, ominous sign. What happened is what aviation calls a stall. The wing exceeded its critical angle of attack, the limit past which air no longer flows smoothly over it. Lift vanishes almost instantly. The airplane, which a second earlier was confidently climbing, stops flying and begins to fall nose first. The roll to the right tells you that one half of the wing let go a fraction before the other. Now everything is working against Stuckey. The RV-7 drops into a near-vertical descent, nose pointed at the ground. To pull an airplane out of that attitude, you need altitude. You need room to build speed, restore airflow over the wing, and gently raise the nose. But there is no altitude. Between the point of the stall and the field lie only those 50-odd meters he'd managed to gain. It's far too little. The most experienced hands on the controls are powerless here. No amount of skill can stretch out feet that don't exist. The airplane curves down to the ground in a short, near-vertical arc. The RV-7 slams into the field just 375 feet southwest of the very strip it had risen from a minute earlier. There was one person on board, and he is killed instantly. A flight that began as a familiar Saturday routine ends almost at the threshold of his own hangar. On the ground, it's a grim scene. The wreckage of a light airplane in the field, a column of smoke rising over the corn, rescue vehicles racing in. There's no one left to save. The first theory falls into place almost on its own, and it sounds convincing. A dramatic maneuver close to the ground went wrong. The vertical climb, the stall, the vertical plunge, and a catastrophic lack of altitude to pull the machine out. The combination of experienced aerobatic pilot plus low altitude is grimly well known in aviation. It's precisely in low-level aerobatics, where there's no room for error, that even outstanding pilots are killed again and again. The line between a brilliant performance and a tragedy here is thinner than a hair. The witnesses only confirm that picture. They say Stuckey had rolled barrels, spun, and made inverted passes over the strip before. Those maneuvers were his signature style. There was nothing unusual to the locals about him going for a maneuver once again. It's just that this time, the sky didn't let him go. At first glance, everything is clear. The sad but understandable death of an ace who caught a stall on a vertical climb near the ground. Stories like this rarely turn into a major investigation. It seems there's nothing left to examine. And yet, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, the agency that in the United States investigates every aviation accident, from airliners to home-built aircraft, takes the case. It's assigned the number WPR-22 Foxtrot Alpha 254. Investigators come out to the field, examine the wreckage, pull the paperwork, and send the pilot's body for examination. They have to answer the central question of any investigation. Was it really the man who was at fault, or did the equipment fail him and take part of the blame? The work starts with the hardware. Before you can blame the pilot, you have to rule him out. If something broke in the air, the controls jammed, the engine quit, a rod snapped, then the crash is explained by a failure, not by human error. The NTSB specialists take the remains of the RV-7 apart, component by component. They trace the entire control system, the cables, push rods, bell cranks, and the linkages running from the stick and the pedals to the elevators and ailerons. The goal is to make sure the pilot's commands were reaching the control surfaces, and that nothing jammed or broke before the impact with the ground. The integrity of the controls is confirmed throughout. The breaks found in the wreckage are explained by the crash itself, not by a failure that preceded it. The engine is under the microscope too. The experts look for signs of seizing, a thrown connecting rod, a loss of power, anything that could have robbed the light airplane of thrust on that critical vertical. They find nothing. The propeller, the accessories, the controls, everything points to a machine that was working properly. The conclusion of the investigation is unambiguous. The examination of the airframe and engine revealed no mechanical failures that would have interfered with the normal operation of the aircraft. The RV-7 obeyed its pilot right down to the last second. The convenient excuse of the equipment failed is off the table in this case, which means the cause of the stall has to be sought not in the metal, but in the man on the stick. If the machine was fine, then why did such an experienced pilot suddenly exceed the critical angle of attack on a maneuver he had performed hundreds of times? Investigators begin to look for the answer in the place they turn to last in cases like this, in the results of the medical examination of Stephen Stuckey himself. And that's exactly where they find the thing that turns the whole case around. The medical examiners take several samples from the pilot, drawn from different biological tissues. It's done that way to double-check the result and weed out random errors. And in those samples, they find ethanol, that is, alcohol, and not trace insignificant amounts. In the blood, about 0.069 grams per deciliter. In another sample, roughly 0.077. In the other tissues, the concentration was no lower. For Stuckey, those figures meant a level at which a person's reaction time is already slowing and self-control is already dulled. What matters is that the picture across the different tissues matched up. That's what distinguishes alcohol that was actually consumed from post-mortem fermentation, which can sometimes produce false readings of alcohol in one or two samples. Here, the consistency of the samples speaks for itself. According to the experts' findings, the results are consistent with the consumption of alcohol shortly before the flight. This discovery changes the entire logic. Onto a sound, flawlessly functioning machine is laid another fact. The person at its controls had alcohol in his blood. And the question now sounds different. Why did a very small dose of alcohol turn out to be fatal for a pilot with thousands of hours behind him? The answer lies in the very nature of what Stuckey was doing in the air. Low-altitude aerobatics is work at the absolute limit. A maneuver flown 50 meters off the ground leaves no margin of height and no margin of time. There's no room here for a half-second delay or a single extra degree of angle. The pilot has to feel the machine in his fingertips and react before he even has time to think. And it's exactly that delicate mechanism that alcohol strikes at. It dulls precisely what matters most on a vertical climb near the ground: speed of reaction, precision of movement, a clear-headed read of the situation. Even mild intoxication stretches out the response time, smears the sense of an approaching stall, makes the hand a touch less precise. What a sober ace would have caught reflexively, a man who'd been drinking notices a moment later. And in low-level aerobatics, that moment is the entire difference between a maneuver and a crash. You can imagine how it came together. The airplane climbs vertically, the airspeed bleeds away, the wing gives off the first warning signs of buffeting. And right there, a reaction late by a fraction of a second decides everything. The stick eased forward a touch too late, the movement a touch too sharp, a touch too much faith in his own abilities. And the wing let go. There was a second, hidden enemy too, his own experience. 5,000 hours and hundreds of performances bred a false confidence. I've done this countless times. I'll do it again today. Being used to taking risks near the ground lulls your caution to sleep. And that's where two forces came together: a mastery that admits no fear, and alcohol that stole his last reserve of precision. The best of pilots sometimes die on a maneuver that's easy for them, precisely because they've stopped considering it dangerous. The investigation reaches its official conclusion a year and a half later. In January of 2024, the NTSB publishes its final report on case WPR-22, Foxtrot Alpha 254, and in it, all the threads of the investigation are drawn together. The primary cause of the crash is named as the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane while performing an aerobatic maneuver immediately after takeoff. This led to exceeding the critical angle of attack, to an aerodynamic stall, and to impact with the ground. The dry wording maps precisely onto what the witnesses saw from the ground. Recorded on a separate line in the report is a contributing factor: the pilot's impairment from alcohol consumed before the flight. The board did not declare alcohol the sole cause of the tragedy. Formally, it was the loss of control during the maneuver that led to his death. But the investigators didn't write the alcohol off either. It's named outright as the thing that pushed an experienced man into a fatal mistake. On a sound machine, at a familiar airfield, in clear weather, the deciding factor turned out to be an invisible one inside the pilot himself. And that's where the bitter rarity of this case lies. Usually behind accidents like this stands a novice who overestimated himself. Here, though, the man who died was a decorated master, a man people took their hats off to. A retired master sergeant of the National Guard, a builder of his own airplanes, the heart and soul of the local air shows, a man whose name every pilot in the area knew. They remember him with respect, and that makes it all the harder to bear that what failed him wasn't the sky or the machine, but a bottle before the flight. Respect for his memory doesn't soften the harshness of the lesson. Stuckey died a few hundred yards from his own home, in a machine he'd built himself, on a strip he knew by heart. Everything was his own, familiar, safe-looking, and it was precisely that deceptive sense of safety that formed the backdrop to the tragedy. His first airplane, that very ease, still stands today in the Aviation Museum in the town of Coffeyville, a memorial to a man who loved the sky and knew how to build wings with his own hands. People speak of him warmly, and in those words there is no condemnation, only sorrow. The Topeka case didn't spark any loud reforms, didn't rewrite the regulations, didn't become the foundation for new rules. It's one of those quiet, unnoticed tragedies that repeat themselves in general aviation year after year, never making the major headlines. And maybe that's exactly why its lesson rings out so clearly. The lesson is simple and merciless. Alcohol and low-level aerobatics are incompatible at any level of skill. Not thousands of flight hours, not brilliant ratings, not the fame of being the best ace in the county, can override either human physiology or the laws of aerodynamics. A wing stalls the same way under a novice as it does under a legend. The most dangerous thought in the cockpit of a light airplane is, "I'm an ace, the rules don't apply to me." Stephen Stuckey could do almost everything a pilot can do. What destroyed him was the small handful of things no person at the controls should ever allow himself. And in that, the story of a quiet Kansas field is equally unforgiving to everyone who rises into the sky. Picture a flight that landed perfectly. Smooth, precise, not a single complaint from a passenger. And then, the entire crew is arrested right at the bottom of the stairs. On March 8, 1990, a Boeing 727, operated by Northwest Airlines, brought 91 people from Fargo to Minneapolis, and the 3 men in the cockpit ended up in handcuffs. The captain, the first officer, and the flight engineer had flown the airliner with alcohol in their blood, after spending the previous evening drinking in a bar. This is the only story in our collection with no wreckage and no casualties, and the first criminal case in U.S. history brought against a crew for flying drunk. How did they get away with it in the air? And is it possible to come back from a place where it seems no one ever returns? Early morning of that same day, the airliner is descending over Minneapolis, Flight 650 out of Fargo, North Dakota. A short hop, about an hour in the air, routine for any crew. 91 people in the cabin. Some are dozing, some flipping through a newspaper, some waiting for a connection. Outside, everything looks normal. The landing gear comes down on time. The flaps deploy on schedule. The jet lines up with the end of the runway. The plane touches the concrete softly. No shudder, no warning siren, not a single complaint on board. The pilots did their job so well that the passengers barely noticed the flight was over. By every formal measure, this was a textbook landing. It's a strange story, the strangest in the whole collection. There's no burning wreckage on a hillside, no black box dragged up from the seabed, no list of the dead. The plane is intact, everyone is alive. On the face of it, there's nothing to investigate. But the moment the engines shut down and the spinning stops, 3 men in the cockpit are taken into custody right at the foot of the stairs. The captain, the first officer, and the flight engineer are led away in front of bewildered airport staff. Within a few hours, their names will be in the news across the country. This is the first criminal trial in United States history against the crew of a passenger airliner for flying the plane drunk. Not for a crash, because there wasn't one, but for the bare fact of it. 3 men with alcohol in their blood took a machine carrying 90-some passengers into the sky and set it down as if nothing were the matter. To understand how a safe landing turned into handcuffs, you have to rewind the clock to 12 hours before the wheels of that 727 touched the runway in Minneapolis. The evening of March 7th, across the river from Fargo, in the town of Moorhead, Minnesota, there's a bar and restaurant called the Speakeasy. Wednesday is a special night here, jokingly known as Whoopee Wednesday, an evening of discounted drinks, when the place is packed. At one of the tables sit 3 men in civilian clothes, but this is the crew of tomorrow's flight. The senior man at the table is Captain Norman Lyle Prowse, 52 years old, a longtime Boeing 727 commander. Beside him is First Officer Robert Kirchner, 36, and Flight Engineer Joseph Balzer, 35. Early the next morning, they're due to fly a passenger jet from Fargo to Minneapolis. Departure is set for just after 6 a.m. Later, at trial, a document would surface that few expected to see in a flight safety case, an ordinary bar tab. The total? $54.61. On the list, 14 rum and diet colas and 6 pitchers of beer. Captain Prowse ordered the hard liquor. Kirchner and Balzer stuck mostly to beer. And that's only what made it onto the check. Investigators would find that the night didn't end there. Some of the other patrons, recognizing the men as pilots, bought them several more cocktails and beers off the tab. The exact amount they drank would remain a matter of dispute, but the ballpark figures speak for themselves. No one at the table, it seems, sees a problem with any of this. There are still hours until the flight, and the party rolls on. From the outside, it told the story more vividly than any bar tab. Other patrons of the Speakeasy that night watched the trio at the table grow visibly more drunk. By the end of the evening, Flight Engineer Balzer could barely keep his eyes focused. He and First Officer Kirchner could no longer walk straight. They were staggering. Captain Prowse stayed longer than the others. At one point, he lost his balance and fell off his stool. The waitress serving the table stopped bringing him drinks. literally a few minutes before he finally got up and headed for the door. The clock read about 11:30 at night. The hotel where the crew was staying stood right nearby. But 20 minutes later, Prowse came back into the bar. He couldn't find the hotel that was practically next door. That scene, a grown man lost a stone's throw from his bed, was the last straw for someone in the room. One of the bar's patrons picked up the phone and called the Federal Aviation Administration's duty line. He reported something simple and alarming. The crew of tomorrow's flight had been drinking all evening and were heavily intoxicated. Who exactly made that call remains unknown to this day. The name of the person who raised the alarm was never revealed. An anonymous citizen whose face no one remembered turned out to be the only one who tried, that night, to stop the disaster bearing down on them. Word of the drunk crew landed on the aviation agency's desk overnight, hours before the flight. There was time to step in. From there, everything hinged on one thing: what the people who received the warning would do with it. And that would become one of the most contested points in the entire story. The morning of March 8th, around 5:45, at the Fargo airport, a man named Addison climbs aboard the Boeing 727, Verl Addison, an FAA inspector. The overnight call hadn't gone unanswered. The agency had sent one of its own to check on the crew in person before departure. Addison steps into the cockpit and strikes up a conversation with Captain Prowse and First Officer Kirshner. What he notices is hard to mistake for anything else: bloodshot eyes, the stale smell of alcohol that hadn't aired out overnight. In front of him sit men who reek as if they'd just left the bar moments ago. And here's the part that people would dissect again and again. The inspector does not pull the crew. He doesn't call for replacements, doesn't ground the flight. The plane is cleared into the sky. Meanwhile, the airline itself had a strict internal rule: at least 12 hours between the last drink and the controls. All three had broken it blatantly and crudely, some of them drinking until nearly midnight, then sitting in a pilot's seat by 6 in the morning. The very rule designed to prevent exactly this situation had been trampled. Meanwhile, the passengers are filing into the cabin. 91 people take their seats, fasten their belts, listen to the standard safety briefing. None of them know anything about the speakeasy, or the 6 pitchers of beer, or the fall off the stool, or the inspector who stood in that cockpit minutes earlier and signed off anyway. For the passengers, it's just a morning flight home. The doors close. The alarm was raised, the warning passed up through every level. And still, a machine full of people rolled toward takeoff, with a crew that had spent nearly the whole night drinking. Flight 650 lifts off the Fargo runway and settles onto a heading for Minneapolis. Ahead lies about an hour of flying over the plains of the Midwest. From the ground, from the controller's screens, over the radio, everything looks entirely normal. The jet climbs, reaches its cruising level, holds steady. And here lies the central paradox of the whole story. The aircraft is being flown by 3 men, each with enough alcohol in his blood that he wouldn't have been allowed behind the wheel of a car. And the airliner flies as if drawn with a ruler. The numbers would come to light later, when the crew's blood was drawn on the ground, sometime after landing. Captain Prowse would measure 0.12%, 3 times the criminal threshold for a pilot at the time, and well above the level at which a driver loses his license. First Officer Kirchner came in at 0.06, Flight Engineer Balzer at 4, and all of that was after part of the alcohol had already left their systems. At the moment of takeoff, the readings were higher. In a cockpit where the instruments demand a clear head and fast reactions, sit men in a state doctors would call serious intoxication, and yet nothing happens. No stall, no dangerous bank, no panic in the cabin, not a single alarming moment that the passengers would ever know about. The flight goes off flawlessly from the first minute to the last. The whole drama here isn't that 91 people nearly died, but that they survived. The risk was enormous, and the reckoning never came. The plane calmly began its descent, and that very perfect landing was about to turn into evidence. While the 727 taxied along the Minneapolis ramp, they were already waiting on the ground. The passengers wandered calmly through the terminal, collected their bags, scattered to their business, none of them ever learning how close their morning flight had come. The crew, though, would not get off so easily. The FAA inspector, having waited for the flight to arrive, carried out what American law calls a citizen's arrest, detaining the pilots right there in the airport without waiting for police. The 3 men who had confidently landed the jet an hour earlier were pulled aside for questioning. What followed was a procedure more familiar to a highway patrol than to civil aviation. All three had their blood drawn for testing. The results left no room for interpretation. The alcohol in each man's blood exceeded the legal limit. Those numbers would form the foundation of the coming charges. The employer reacted instantly. Northwest Airlines first grounded the crew, then fired all three. The government struck next. The Federal Aviation Administration revoked the pilot certificates of Pruce, Kirchner, and Balzer. In a single morning, men who had given the sky years of their lives lost both their jobs and the very right to climb into a cockpit. The story immediately spilled beyond the aviation bulletins. A drunk crew on a passenger jet. That headline ran in every newscast. The public, accustomed to trusting the man in the cap at the controls, was stunned. The image of the captain as the very embodiment of reliability cracked in front of the whole country. But what lay ahead had never happened before in American history. To fire someone and strip their license is one thing. To put civilian airline pilots in prison over alcohol, no one had ever tried that. It would take a law, and such a law existed, a young one, never yet applied to the crew of a large aircraft. In U.S. law, up until the mid-1980s, there had been a strange gap. A drunk driver was prosecuted without question, but there was essentially no separate criminal statute for flying an aircraft while intoxicated. It was assumed that the discipline of the aviation industry and the fear of being fired were enough. Life showed that they weren't, always. In 1986, Congress closed that gap. A federal law appeared that directly made it a crime to operate an aircraft with a blood alcohol content above a set threshold. The rule sat on paper for several years. There had simply been no one to apply it to in full. Flight 650 changed that. The case of the three Northwest pilots became the first in the country in which that law was applied to the crew of a passenger airliner. The precedent that every similar trial would later cite was being born right here, in a federal courtroom. The prosecution rested on three things: the testimony of witnesses from the speakeasy, the fall off the stool, and the wandering in search of the hotel, the $54 tab itemizing everything they drank, and the blood tests taken right after landing. There was almost nothing left to argue against that combination. Captain Prowse's defense tried the only move available, to prove that by the time of the flight he was no longer drunk, that his body had processed the alcohol, and he had been in full control in the cockpit. He even took the stand to testify himself. But the jurors, looking at the numbers and listening to the witnesses, didn't buy it, and the stakes were as high as they get. On charges like these, each man faced up to 15 years in prison, plus heavy fines. Years behind bars now hung over three people who had killed no one and injured no one. The country was about to see what sentence would be handed down in a case without a single victim, where the risk had remained nothing but risk. On August 20th, 1990, less than 6 months after that morning flight, the court rendered its verdict. All three were found guilty. The jurors didn't accept the defense's arguments. Men who had been seen staggering at night and in whose blood alcohol was found that morning were held responsible for taking the controls of an airliner. The punishment was meted out by degree of responsibility. Captain Norman Lyle Prowse, as commander of the aircraft, received the harshest term, 16 months in prison. First Officer Robert Kirchner and Flight Engineer Joseph Balzer got 12 months each. The case was heard and the sentence delivered by federal judge James Rosenbaum, whose name would return to this story from an unexpected direction. For the entire aviation industry, it was a cold shower. A suspension or the loss of a license was one thing. People were used to that. It was something else entirely when civilian pilots of a major airline were sent to a real federal prison in handcuffs. That had simply never happened before. A profession wrapped in an aura of discipline and trust saw its own behind bars for the first time. Not for a catastrophe, but for one that might never have come to pass. For the three men themselves, it was the collapse of an entire life. In a single day, everything built over decades came crashing down. Their names now stood in the papers next to the word criminal. Wives, children, colleagues, years of service, all of it crushed by one night in a bar. This is where the story might have ended. A warning, a moral, a full stop. Three broken men go off to serve their time. The industry draws its lessons. Curtain. But the most incredible part began at exactly that low point, and it has everything to do with the man who had been sitting in the captain's seat of Flight 650. To grasp the scale of the fall, it helps to know who this man had been before the speakeasy. Preuss was a Marine, a Vietnam veteran, a man who had been through war. After his service, he built a career in civil aviation from the very bottom, and over more than 20 years at Northwest Airlines, he had climbed into the left seat, the captain's seat, of a Boeing 727. On the surface, a model of discipline and a life well made. Behind that facade hid alcoholism, a disease he had long concealed not only from the company, but from himself. The night in Moorhead was no accident, but the natural consequence of an addiction that had smoldered for years beneath an immaculate uniform. The arrest in the prison tore away the mask, and beneath it there was nothing but a sick man. What came next was decided by a single step he took. Right after the arrest, Preuss entered a treatment program for addiction, not to soften his sentence, but because there was no other way left to survive. He admitted the disease, stopped arguing with the facts, and began the long work on himself, with no guarantee at all that it would change anything. Out of that came a letter. Preuss wrote to Judge James Rosenbaum, the very man who had sent him behind bars. A long appeal, 11 pages. No attempt to make excuses, no legal tricks. It was the honest confession of a man owning his guilt completely and describing what he intended to do with his shattered life. And the letter worked. The judge, who had seen hundreds of convicts pass through his courtroom, recognized something genuine in those pages. Instead of writing the pilot off, he left him a loophole that almost everyone around considered firmly shut, a chance, someday, to try to win back the licenses that had been taken from him. From that moment on, the story stops being a tale of crime and punishment. Now it's a tale of whether a man can rebuild from nothing what seemed to have been taken away forever. Behind that half-open door, though, lay an almost sheer mountain. The licenses had been revoked entirely, which meant they had to be earned back entirely, from the very first rung. The former captain of a heavy jet sat down again with the manuals and the simulators to re-earn a simple private pilot certificate, like any beginner approaching a small plane for the first time. Everything he knew had to be proven again from a blank page. There was something to lean on. Preuss went through a program called HIMS, a special rehabilitation system for professional pilots with alcohol and other addictions. Its purpose isn't to write a man off, but, through honest treatment and oversight, to return a sober professional to the line. For a pilot who had admitted his disease, this was a real, proven path back. There was also a man at the very top willing to take the risk. The head of Northwest Airlines, John Dasberg, had grown up himself in a family with a drinking parent and understood the nature of this affliction from the inside. He made a decision that surprised many, to give Preuss a second chance at the very company that had fired him. First, a year of work in the training department, on the ground, under supervision. In May 1995, 5 years after the arrest, Norman Lyle Preuss returned to the line, as first officer on a wide-body Boeing 747. Almost no one had believed it would happen. The man who had been led away in handcuffs from the stairs of the 727 was climbing back into the sky with passengers behind him, sober and under the strictest oversight. After 2 more years of spotless work, management made the final decision. He was reinstated to the rank of captain, and in 1998, on the very day of his 60th birthday, Preuss retired as commander of that same 747. He ended his career in the seat he had seemed to lose forever that March morning in Minneapolis. This story has an official seal on the captain's whole fate as well. In 2001, President Bill Clinton signed Preuss a pardon, a formal recognition that the man had atoned for his guilt and lived the rest of his life differently. A rare instance in which the state that had sent a pilot to prison closed the case itself, with mercy. The 2 other men of Flight 650 went their own ways. Flight engineer Joseph Balzer later told the story from the inside in his own book, an account of 3 drunk pilots and the fight for a second chance. And the case itself became firmly embedded in aviation safety training materials as a textbook example of where alcohol the night before a flight can lead. But the main mark the case left was in people's minds, both in the industry and in the public. The principle of bottle to throttle stopped being an internal slogan and gained the weight of an actual law, with real prison time behind it. After 1990, every pilot in America knew a drink before a flight could now land you in jail, and the precedent already existed. Yet an uncomfortable gap remained in this story. The alarm, after all, was raised in time. An anonymous bar patron made the call. The inspector came into the cockpit, smelled the alcohol, and still cleared the flight. The system received every signal and did not stop the plane. What saved everyone was not a rule and not a procedure, but blind luck and the fact that time, it turned out all right. With this story, we close our collection about alcohol at the controls. Of all its stories, this is the only one in which everyone came out alive, where there was no wreckage and no memorial lists. And perhaps that is exactly why it's the most important. Here, the cost of the mistake was measured not by the number of the dead, but by what was avoided, quite literally by a miracle. There remains only one quiet question, one that no report can answer. How many more flights like this once landed safely, and how many of them will we simply never know about?